I want to just introduce a little bit about the background of Judges before we have the first of those two readings, and then we'll go in and look at the subject material for that. Judges is an interesting book. It is, on the whole, generally chronological. It starts in chapter 1 with the Othniel, the first of the judges that's recorded, and then they go in order of when they worked in the land of Israel, up to Samson in chapter 16. And Samson, of course, was the great hero judge of the tribe of Dan. And then from there, we jump to the next judge, Samuel, who's not really at all in the book of Judges. And in fact, his interaction is in two separate books, which are a couple of books further on from the book of Judges. One could argue that Samuel was the greatest of the judges, and I think that's probably fairly easy to defend. And in those books we read about his interactions with the nation. We read about his interactions with the first of the kings, Saul, before he became a king and afterwards, and with the following king, David. But in between those two, there are three interesting appendices that are added in after chapter 16 of Judges. And I just want to talk a bit about them before we look at one of them in detail. The first one is in Judges 17 and 18. I've called it the Lonely Levite. It's about a Levite, and we hear about him, and then we find out what his name is a bit later on in the story. And the next one is about the Benjamite civil war, and another different Levite is involved in that, in playing a key part in the beginning of that one too. So the last 5 chapters of Judges are about not any judges at all, but 2 interesting stories during the time of the judges. And if we were to line them up between Othniel and Samson, it's almost certain that both of them happened right near the beginning of Judges rather than towards the end. So they're out of order, and they've been added there for a fairly special reason, and we won't think about that as we go along tonight. The third appendix, before we get to the life of the last great judge, Samuel, is the story in the book of Ruth and Boaz. And again, there's no judge necessarily there, and it's a story which has a lot of lessons for us. And it also, I think, chronologically appears well before Samson in the story of the judges. So it's interesting that these 3 stories, appendixes to the story of the judges in general, are put after the general book of Judges and have special messages for us. So that's where we're going to be, and we're going to simply look at chapters 17 and 18 now, remembering that this story is not specifically about a judge, but about the way that the community was living during the time of the judges and a particular Levite. So if I can get, I think it's Ian to read for us that first chapter of Judges, chapter 17, and then we'll talk a little bit about that.
Judges chapter 17, Micah's idols. Now a man named Micah from the hill country of Ephraim said to his mother, "The 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you and about which I have heard you utter a curse, I have that silver with me. I took it." Then his mother said, "The Lord bless you, my son." When he returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother, she said, "I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord for my son to make a carved image and a cast idol. I will give it back to you." So he returned the silver to his mother, and she took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to a silversmith, who made them into the image and the idol. And they were put in Micah's house. Now this man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and some idols, and installed one of his sons as his priest. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. A young Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, who had been living within the clan of Judah, left that town in search of some other place to stay. On his way, he came to Micah's house in the hill country of Ephraim. Micah asked him, "Where are you from?" I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, he said, and I'm looking for a place to stay. Then Micah said to him, live with me and be my father and priest, and I'll give you 10 shekels of silver a year, your clothes and your food. So the Levite agreed to live with him, and the young man was to him like one of his sons. Then Micah installed the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in his house. And Micah said, now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since this Levite has become my priest.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's an interesting and a slightly strange story, isn't it? So, what I'd like to do is just tease out a few of the ideas from this chapter, starting with those first few verses that were read, and then we'll go from there. The first thing we come to, of course, is this family. We don't know much about the family, but it's Micah's family, for want of a better term, because that's the only name we know. The family is actually made up of Mum and the son, her son Micah, and Micah's son, and presumably lots of others in the family, that they're the only ones that we know of. It would seem almost certain that there are quite a lot more in the family. The next thing is this extraordinary story of theft. And it's introduced in such a concise way, I must admit. In that first couple of verses, there's an amazing amount of story. Someone's stolen a big heap of money, and the mum is really worried about it. We don't know whether Dad and everyone else was involved or not, but she certainly is. And it turns out very quickly, even in the first couple of verses, that the person who stole it is Micah, the son. It's a very strange situation, isn't it? That one's son would steal a lot of money from a mother. And the next question is, why does he, right up front, right at the beginning, when we first meet him, own up and say, here's the money? The answer is what?
The Lord bless you.
Well, before that, why did he own up, do you think? Because she uttered a curse, didn't she? I think he was scared out of his wits. He was petrified. She had, in his presence, uttered a curse. Now, this leads me to suspect that Mum had a pretty good idea who'd pinched the money in the first place. And so Mum, in the presence of Micah, uttered this fairly scary curse if his immediate reaction is to grab the money and bring it back, I think. I must admit that my thoughts turned immediately to a Shakespeare play that I read many, many years ago when we were in high school, where the witches' chorus goes double, double, toil and trouble, a fire burn and cauldron bubble. And this sounds a bit like it might have been a curse like that, a scary curse, a magical curse, rather than anything to do with the law of God. And for whatever reason, it really terrified Micah, and he coughed the money up straight away. And the consequence of that, as John said, that she immediately blessed him. Now, this again is not, I don't think, an ordinary blessing. You wouldn't say, good on you, mate, or something like that. I think this was another magical incantation to cancel out the curse. Now, we're seeing here a very pagan kind of interaction. And it's the first hint that this family has absorbed a lot of the Canaanite culture of the time. And I did see in one of the commentaries on that word Canaanization, which I'd not ever heard. I don't know whether it's really a word or not. But it seemed to me to summarise a lot of what goes on in Judges, that gradually the Canaanite influence affected the nation of Israel, and they began to change their ways and their behaviours accordingly. So he's blessed to sort of cancel out the curse, and then we find that the money is returned. It's a little bit vague in that chapter about who gave it to who when. It's returned to the mum, and the mum says, oh, it's I'm going to give it to God, and then she gives some of it to him, and then she takes it back and makes an idol of it. So it's a fairly confusing kind of family situation. But the interesting thing is perhaps how much of it was stolen. We're told it was 1,100 shekels of silver, which is a weight of silver. And of course, my immediate question was, how much is that? And it's pretty hard to know what that is in everyday terms. But we can see verse 10 of the chapter that was just read to us, where the salary package for the fake priest, if you like, the Levite, was outlined by Micah. He said, "Dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year," so it's an annual salary, "and a suit of clothes each year." I presume it means a whole suitcase of clothes, not just one, "and your sustenance." So it was board and lodgings and an annual salary, if you like. So what I did next was have a look at the Australian statistical website, and the South Australian average annual salary for a male in May 2021 was $75,000. It rather surprised me. It was fairly good, I thought. And then I thought, well, that's probably everyone who's getting an annual salary. It doesn't count all the part-time workers or those that are still looking for jobs or those that are on some kind of COVID assistance or everything else. But nevertheless, that's a fairly substantial amount of money, even in our present-day situation. So I would think that a priest in an extensive family, and Micah's family, I'm sure, is quite a big one, in fact, even though we only meet a few of the members, was probably getting about what the average male would get in Adelaide these days. Now, if that's true of 10 shekels, then what's stolen was about $8.25 million Australian dollars. You can see why Mum was a bit cranky now, right? In other words, what was stolen was 110 years' salary, if you want to put it in terms of years' salary. And that's a pretty good indication that this just wasn't a little tiny village up in the hill country of Ephraim. It was probably the leading family and quite a large clan of the Ephraimite tribe, I would suspect. But we can't be certain, and the details are not exactly right, but it does sort of flesh out the idea, doesn't it? We are talking large sums of money here, and you can understand why people got a bit uptight about it. Well, what was done with the money, as we read, was she dedicated it to God. It was what Jesus called korban, the scribes and Pharisees of Jesus' time, and they used that as a sort of a legal way of getting out of their obligations. And I think that she's done the same thing to a certain extent, hasn't she? She's dedicated the money to God, and then we next find that she's actually only used 20% of it to set up this sanctuary. We don't know what's happened to the rest of it. She set aside 200 shekels and made an altar, an image. It reads as though she's made two, a graven and a cast image, but the language of images in the Old Testament is a little bit vague. Often the two terms are used to describe a single image, like the image that was cast by Aaron, the golden calf, for example. So it may have been one, it may have been two, it doesn't matter very much, but whatever it was, she was using the money to make an image which was, of course, against the law of Moses. We're going to come back to what the meaning of all of this is in a minute, but I just want to stop and look at the next verse because it's quite interesting. Verse 6 said, "In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did what was right in his own eyes." Now, that doesn't occur in Judges until here in verse 17. But the idea is very common in Judges that people weren't obeying God and were doing what they liked, if you'd like to say. And it's significantly mentioned here at the beginning of chapter 17. It's also mentioned at the very last book in Judges, at the end of these 5 chapters of the appendix in Judges. Identical. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Now, the reason why king is introduced here, I'm not sure. It probably has to do with the person who's compiling this Judges and writing it up as a final book, which was probably after they had kings. And he was pointing out to the readers, look, you might have thought this Judges was pretty chaotic. Now that we've got a king, we're a little bit more organised, not necessarily doing much better at serving God, but a little bit more structured perhaps. It also occurs 2 more times in the beginning of chapter 18 and chapter 19, where it just says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and the bit about doing what's right in your own eyes is left off, although the implication is, I think, still there. It's an idea that was brought up later on in Proverbs, when we read it in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 12. There is a way that seems right to man, but its end is the way of death, says the wise man in Proverbs. So I think that's a salutary warning, and the lessons in Judges are a salutary warning that there's a problem with having your own way, and you end up with some problems if you're not careful. So let's look at the second half of the chapter quickly. When we get into verse 7, we meet our lonely Levite. Now, we're not told he's lonely, but he's left the city where he has apparently been living, which is Bethlehem in Judah, the big tribe of Judah, and he's wandered up into Ephraim, which is the next biggest tribe in the nation, and it's further to the north. He doesn't seem to have anyone with him, and he doesn't seem to have a purpose. And one wonders why exactly this is. We're not told, but perhaps he was out of work because the people in Bethlehem weren't interested in God and God's law. Because the role of the Levite was primarily to teach people about God and his law. And if he had no customers because no one wanted to hear, that might have been the reason. But it also might have been because he got into some kind of problems. In chapter 19, we hear of another Levite from Bethlehem that gets into problems too, a different person. It may be that he just was plain bored and thought, I'll have to go hiking around and see if I can find something more interesting to do. Who knows? It may have been that the people of Bethlehem decided, we want to get rid of you, you're not doing any good for us, and asked him to move. We just can't know, it's just supposition. Anyway, he turns up here and he meets this family and he's offered a job. Now, at this stage, there's a family shrine and it's got some very expensive idols in it and a very flash priestly garment called an ephod and some other things there. And the grandson of the mother is running the show. And Micah decides it would be a bit more prestigious if I had a Levite as my priest. And so he asks him, would he like the job? And he accepts. We don't know why he accepted, but he did accept. It may have been because he thought he would do more good there than he could have done somewhere else. It may have been because he was rather proud to be an important person in this very wealthy and important clan in one of the biggest tribes in Israel. It may have been because he wanted the salary, which is, I think, a pretty good salary for those days. A massive salary, I think, for those days. And so he's consecrated or initiated into the priesthood, inverted commas, by Micah. So Micah said to his son, right, we'll get this guy to do it. He's more important, he'll do a better job. And apparently the son agreed. He may or may not have had much to do with it. I don't know. The problem is, of course, under the law, the only person who could consecrate anyone to any of the work of the Levitical tribe was the high priest, and he could only consecrate Aaron's family to be priests. The Levites couldn't be priests, and in fact, on pain of death, the law says. So we have now this extraordinary verse where Micah's thinking, and I think he's probably fairly genuine in thinking this, it's all going to be all right now. He's got a Levite for a priest. He's got a nice, expensively set up sanctuary in his own village, in his own house, everything's going to be good. Now I know that the Lord will be good to me since I have a Levite as a priest. Ignoring all of the irregularities in the process, he still felt confident because he thought he was doing a good job. And that's a bit of a warning for us, isn't it? We can think we're doing a good job unless we're careful. We can in fact be doing a terrible job and getting ourselves into more trouble than it's worth. I think what Micah thought is, I can keep this in the family, I can make sure that everything goes on, agrees with my views, I can control this worship and what's going to be said to all of the relatives and the locals in the area. In other words, I can control God and not let God control me. And that seems to me that's what's underneath this whole idea. So there were lots of things which were wrong with making this home a shrine, and we're going to have a look at a few of them now. First of all, and I ducked out to see if I could find a pointer and I couldn't find one at short notice, but this is the allocation of the tribes in this middle bit of the nation. You can see Ephraim there in big letters, and roughly where the A in Ephraim is where the mountains of Ephraim were, and that's where Micah's got his clan, his family. Underneath it, down the bottom here, is Judah, just near Jerusalem, and Judah and Ephraim are the two really big tribes in Israel, of course. Judah became the nucleus with Benjamin of the southern kingdom after Solomon, and Ephraim became the nucleus of the northern kingdom, with the other tribes joining him. Dan has been allocated the area from Benjamin across to the coast between the two big tribes. Dan was a fairly big tribe, quite a bit bigger than Benjamin, but had a lot of trouble with that, and we'll come to that in a minute. And Shiloh is circled or got a blue square around it because that's where the tabernacle was at this time. And we're told that. Now, the interesting thing is from where the mountains of Ephraim are to Shiloh, it doesn't show in this map, but I got out the ruler and checked it, is about 8 kilometres, give or take a bit, right? So for Micah to walk to the tabernacle, he had an 8-kilometre walk. It's not a really hard walk, is it? In fact, Micah and his clan were probably close to Shiloh than 90-something% of the whole nation of Israel. They had no real reason at all geographically to set up their own little worship. So that's the first thing about it. Firstly, what's wrong with it is not God's way. God said you worship in the tabernacle, you don't worship in your own homes. And there's reasons for that, I think. The tabernacle and the priests and the Levites made a cohesive Old Testament ecclesial family which strengthened and encouraged and helped them. That's why we come to an ecclesia, because all our different opinions, much as we sometimes don't like the different opinions, they help us get a rounded and more mature view of what God's purpose is. If we go off on our own, we can get quite badly sidetracked. It was very close by, so it's not God's way. Secondly, it was a home and not the tabernacle. Third, it contained graven images, prohibited. Fourth, the priest should be Aaron's family and not a Levite. Fifth, the ephod was a high priest's garment. No one in that family or that organisation had the right to read it, to wear it, let alone make it even, and certainly not to consecrate it. It was set up by Micah and not consecrated by the high priest. And the things in a sanctuary, the most holy place, under God's law had to be gold, not silver. And there's a whole lot of symbolism there. It had to be the most precious, the most pure metal. It had to symbolise that which is the only pure thing, which is God and his worship. So there were all these problems with their setup. Now, what I'd like to do now is stop and have a look at the next chapter. And when we've... I forgot I put one more in there. There were some teraphim there. We don't learn that till we read Judges chapter 18. Teraphim are little tiny family idols that were common in Canaan and not common in Israel, but they became common from this time on. You remember the stories of them in some of the stories of Israel. The Canaanites seemed to line them up with inheritance. If you got the family gods, then you were entitled to inherit the family money as well. And so the suggestion is that these teraphim, they were little family idols, only small ones that were made and put into shrines, actually had a bit more significance than just being secondary idols, and were, of course, nothing to do with the worship of God. So we'll have a look then at the second chapter, and then we'll quickly skim through that and see if we can come to some general opinions about it. Thanks, Sam.
Judges 18. In those days, Israel had no king, and in those days the Danite tribe was still looking for a place to settle, because at that time they did not yet have a place to call their own among the tribes of Israel. The Danites sent out from their whole tribe 5 representatives, capable men from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and explore it. They said to them, "Go explore the land." They came to the Ephraimite hill country and spent the night at Micah's house. As they approached Micah's house, they recognized the accent of the young Levite. So they stopped there and said to him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?" He told them what Micah had done for him, saying, "He hired me and I became his priest." They said to him, "Seek a divine oracle for us so we can know if we will be successful on our mission." The priest said to them, "Go with confidence, the Lord will be with you on your mission." So the 5 men journeyed on and arrived in Laish. They noticed that the people there were living securely, like the Sidonians do, undisturbed and unsuspecting. No conqueror was troubling them in any way. They lived far from the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. When the Danites returned to their tribe in Zorah and Eshtaol, their kinsmen asked them, "How did it go?" They said, "Come on, let's attack them, for we saw their land and it is very good. You seem lethargic, but don't hesitate to invade and conquer the land. When you invade, you will encounter unsuspecting people. The land is wide. God is handing it over to you, a place that lacks nothing on earth." So 600 Danites, fully armed, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol. They went up and camped in Kiriath Jearim in Judah. To this day, that place is called the Camp of Dan. It is west of Kiriath Jearim. From there, they travelled through the Ephraimite hill country and arrived at Micah's house. The 5 men who had gone to spy out the land of Laish said to their kinsmen, "Do you realize that inside these houses are an ephod, some personal idols, a carved image, and a metal image? Decide now what you want to do." They stopped there, went inside the young Levite's house, which belonged to Micah, and asked him how he was doing. Meanwhile, the 600 Danites, fully armed, stood at the entrance to the gate. The 5 men who had gone to spy out the land broke in and stole the carved image, the ephod, the personal idols, and the metal image, while the priest was standing at the entrance to the gate with the 600 fully armed men. When these men broke into Micah's house and stole the carved image, the ephod, the personal idols, and the metal image, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" They said to him, "Shut up, put your hand over your mouth and come with us. You can be our advisor and priest. Wouldn't it be better to be a priest for a whole Israelite tribe than for just one's family?" And the priest was happy. He took the ephod, the personal idols, the carved image, and joined the group. They turned and went on their way, but they walked behind the children, the cattle, and their possessions. After they had gone a good distance from Micah's house, Micah's neighbours gathered together and caught up with the Danites. When they called out to the Danites turned around and said to Micah, "Why have you gathered together?" He said, "You stole my gods that I made, as well as this priest, and then went away. What do I have left? How can you have the audacity to say to me, 'What do you want?'" The Danites said to him, "Don't say another word to us, or some very angry men will attack you, and you and your family will die." The Danites went on their way, And when Micah realized they were too strong to resist, he turned around and went home. Now the Danites took what Micah had made, as well as his priest, and came to Laish, where the people were undisturbed and unsuspecting. They struck them down with a sword and burned the city. No one came to the rescue because the city was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. The city was in a valley near Beth Rehob. The Danites rebuilt the city and occupied it. They named it Dan after their ancestor, who was one of Israel's sons. But the city's name used to be Laish. The Danites worshipped the carved image. Jonathan, descendant of Gershom, son of Moses, and his descendants served as priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the exile. They worshipped Micah's carved image the whole time God's authorized shrine was in Shiloh.
Thank you, Sam. Well, the very interesting and very unusual story continues, doesn't it? And now there's a whole tribe involved. And also we learn the Levite's name. So instead of calling him a lonely Levite, we can call him Jonathan now, the grandson of Moses. And it was mentioned there right at the end of the chapter. That is rather interesting, that grandson of Moses thing, because most of the manuscripts, the most recent ones in Hebrew, say Manasseh and not Moses. But all of the commentators, both the Jewish and the non-Jewish, seem to agree that it should be Moses. And apparently in the Hebrew down here, Moses is, I've transliterated Hebrew symbols that I don't understand using one commentator's expertise until MSH stands for Moses. And what they've done is they've added the extra letter that's normally in Manasseh's name in the Hebrew, the letter Nun, but they haven't put it in capitals like it should be. They've put a little one above it as a reminder to the people who are reading, don't read Moses, read Manasseh. And the suspicion is that they were very uncomfortable that Moses, the hero of the nation, should have a grandson who's made a bit of a mess of his life, quite frankly. And so they said, don't say the grandson of Moses, say the grandson of Manasseh. And that seems to be what even modern Jewish scholars agree about. All right, so let's go back then to this story of Dan. Why do they send the spies out? We were told it was because they were running out of land. They hadn't been able to conquer the land that they were given. And when you think about it, if they hadn't been able to conquer the land that had been allocated to them, drawn by lot by God, then there were a couple of options, weren't there? First of all, they could have another go. They could ask God to give them stronger faith and try again. And that's maybe one option. It's maybe two. Ask God to strengthen their faith and have another more genuine attempt at capturing the land. They could ask all the other tribes to help, because that's what happened in many of the other conquerings of the Canaanite area. But they came up with a third option: find an easier bit of land to conquer, and the bit they found was outside the bounds of the promised land that had been given to the nation of Israel. And it was outside the bounds of what had been given to the tribe of Dan too. So there's a bit of a concern about that. There doesn't seem to be any genuine faithful motive in this tribe at the moment, and no faithful leader, probably well before Samson arrived on the scene, I think. Notice that the land they end up going to is the Sidonian land, and the Sidonians are right up in the north. They're not one of the 5 Canaanite nations that Israel was told you had to wipe out. They were an innocent adjoining nation that God had nothing against, because they hadn't been doing the ungodly things that the Canaanite nations had. But Dan decided to pick them and take them off. This is another shot of that area of the map where the original tribes were. You can see Benjamin, you can see Dan, you can see here Ajalon, about, where is it? Up there somewhere. And those two cities of Eshtaol and that are just near there, that's the area where Samson later was to unite the Dan tribe for a short while, or what was left of it, what actually happened in there is that this is a map of the actual conquered land in lightish yellow. You can see there's a bit there from Jerusalem across to the coast that was never really conquered in the early days of the Judges. Jerusalem, of course, was not, the Jebusite town was not captured until David, well after the Judges. And that Hivite area was largely taken over by what was left of Dan when the rest of the tribe migrated north. But the Amorites were pushed up into the hill country, and in Judges chapter 1 and verse 34, we're told the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. So they were pushed up into the mountains towards the Jerusalem and Judah territories. And that was in Judges chapter 1, and this is another hint that this incident with the Lonely Levite occurred right early in the Judges' history. And when the Amorites were pushed in there, they were pushed in there because the Phoenicians were starting to colonise the whole of this coastline and push the Amorites into the hills as well. If we have a look at a larger map of these territories, I don't expect you to see very much about it, but you can see that here we've got Jerusalem, there's Manasseh and Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar and up the top Naphtali, and the tribes on the other side of Jordan. And if they're going to get to Dan, and Dan is right up the top here, right up the top of the map, I don't know whether I can move it and see it on there. Does that change? Yes. You can see there's a city there that's labelled Dan. It didn't get called Dan till much later. That's where Laish is. And this was the area that they captured. They could come up the west side of the Jordan, in which case they'd have to cross this Canaanite area and then go into Issachar, Zebulun and Naphtali territory, or they could cross the Jordan when they're in Manasseh's territory, travel up through the rest of Manasseh's territory up to Bashan and then up to Laish and get there that way and not have any problems. And there's an indication we'll see later that's probably the way they went. Why was Dan looking there? They probably heard it was a fairly easy area to capture. Also, Naphtali was the adjoining tribe in the encampments in the wilderness. For 40 years, Naphtali and Dan had camped next to each other, and they were the full brothers of each other from Bilhah, the concubine. So they were the only two full brothers in the 12 tribes. So they probably had a lot in common with each other. And for 40 years, they'd lived right next to each other and cooperated. So that might have been why they thought this sounds like a good idea. It's a bit hard to tell. On their way, they stop at Micah's and they recognise Jonathan. Sam's translation said they recognised his accent, I think. Commentators quite don't know how they recognised. Someone suggested recognise the accent. Some suggested they may have actually known him before. And some suggested that perhaps in the shrine he was singing some familiar psalms that made them think, oh, we know that, and go in and see. For whatever reason, anyway, they interact with this Levite, Jonathan, and ask him if what they're going to do is a wise thing. Now that in itself is interesting, isn't it? That's what I think we probably sometimes do. Make a decision what to do and get halfway off doing it and suddenly think, oh, perhaps I should ask God, is this what I really should be doing or not? It's a bit late then, isn't it? We should have been trying to consult with God in the first place and not run into some sort of half-credentialed priest that they didn't know when they were halfway through their job. And what he does is give them a somewhat ambiguous answer. It's a bit hard to translate, and it's translated in a number of different ways by a number of different translators. But the New King James says, "Go in peace, the presence of the Lord be with you on your way." Now, it's not exactly a guarantee that you're going to be successful, is it? Nor does it say you're doing exactly what God wants. But they read it that way. And I think that's a lesson for us too. Sometimes we can see things in Scripture, or we can hear our brothers and sisters say something and we can read it as, oh, they're really pleased with what I'm doing, when it's not quite what they really meant, or that's perhaps not what that Scripture really meant. We're great at convincing ourselves about things when sometimes the meaning's not immediately clear. So off they go, having had this rather half-hearted message from Jonathan, the pretend priest, and they go up there and they observe this area and they find some interesting information, including the fact that it's pretty easy to attack this place and it won't be a serious problem. So they come back, and we heard the very glowing reports they brought back about how wonderful it was and how God was definitely with them, most of which they didn't have any real substance for. And the migration starts, and they pick an armed and trained body plus supported colonisers, if we like, and head off north. And on the way, they run into the Micah shrine area. And they come there, and then they put 600 armed men just outside the door and say, how about you give us your very valuable shrine and all of the accoutrements? And it was really not a request, was it? It was armed robbery, we would call it, with menaces or something rather like that. And when Jonathan ventured to object, they said, I think Sam's version was, shut up and come and join us, otherwise you'll be in real trouble. 600 people out there fully armed, do what's the sensible thing, inverted commas, not what's right with God. And he did it. Now, I am not quite sure why he did it, whether it was for greed or status. Now, they appealed to status. They said, now you'll be the priest of a whole tribe, not just a family or a clan. Maybe he was going to get promotion, a little bit more money, I don't know. But for whatever reason, he decided to join them. And I'm minded of sometimes us who make the decisions to do things for the wrong reasons too. And then off they go, and Micah pursues them and confronts the Danites. And verse 24, when he's confronting them, is most interesting, I think, where he says, you have taken away my gods which I made and the priest. Now, he's not saying you've taken from the sanctuary of the God of Israel and that's not a wise thing to do, you'll never succeed. He's taken my gods that I made, and we see his real motives, I think, in that. And they say, well, what are you going to do about it, basically? And he has to back off. He doesn't have a choice. And so they go on, Laius is overthrown, it's renamed, and the false worship is established. And so that's the end of a really rather sad story, isn't it? In the process, about 6 of the 10 commandments have been broken in one way or other. There's coveting of money, there's theft, there's creating idols, there's certainly not honouring your mother and stealing 110 years' salary from her. And there's probably a few others too, as well as the ones about establishing the priesthood and so on. So it's a very unsavoury story in many ways. I'd like to just go to perhaps a couple more things as little asides before we sort of draw some conclusions from it. There's an interesting prophecy that Jacob gave in Genesis about Dan, in Genesis chapter 14 and verse 17. And it says, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path. It's not exactly a glowing recommendation, is it? And it's suggested that this prophecy was really all about what we've just read. That the northern kingdom and its apostasy and its removal from anything really close to the true worship of God actually started with this false sanctuary in Micah's family, and then the false sanctuary up in Dan, and that kind of attitude to God spread through the northern kingdom, and things got worse. And it might have seemed like a little thing when it was just Micah's family shrine, but it ended up being a disaster for the northern kingdom, and of course they went into captivity. There's another interesting prophecy about Dan that we'll come to in just a minute. But an aside to that is this, that there are two lists of the 12 tribes, one of them in Chronicles and one of them in Revelation 7, that don't have Dan in them. All the other tribes are there, and Dan's, for some reason, just missed. I think they must have noticed that. There must have been people with ancestors in Dan said, hang on, you've missed our tribe. And I think it was Harry Whittaker suggests that perhaps the reason for this is that the scribes, when they were writing Chronicles and when Jesus was inspiring John to write Revelation, wanted us to notice that this little incident about a family shrine and then a tribal shrine was the start of a horrible story for the way in which the nation related to God. And the consequence is that for a lot of people, they missed out on being part of God's kingdom. There's some scary lessons for us there, aren't there? And the second prophecy is not from Jacob, but from Moses in Deuteronomy 33, where Moses says, Dan is a lion's whelp, he shall leap from Bashan. And I think perhaps this is why Dan focused on Laish, because Laish means, the name of the city means lion. So it was the city called Lion City. And it might perhaps be why they said, which side will we go of what's now known as the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Chinnereth? Will we go to the west or the east? We'll go to the east because we will be fulfilling Moses' prophecy. And so off they went feeling very righteous. We're going to be fulfilling Moses' prophecy. We're not breaking God's law. We're helping fulfil God's prophecy through Moses. We can capture this lion city. We'll go up through Bashan and Moses' prophecy will come true, and it's a lot easier for us anyway, and ignoring the fact it was outside the nation of Israel. And there's one final third aside, and that is the last two verses, because there's a problem in the last two verses. Sam read them out quickly, and as you listen to them, you might not have noticed. But 30 says, the children of Dan set up for themselves a carved image, and it lasted for quite a long while until the day of the captivity of the land. And the next verse says, they set for themselves Michael's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. Now, both of those are long periods, but one's a lot longer than the other. And there seems to be a conflict, and that is a bit of a problem. If we go to the right-hand side, until the captivity of the land is when the Assyrians came down and captured Dan in about 732 BC. I'm never super good on exact dates, so forgive me if I'm out a year or so, but round about then. Whereas the last time that the tabernacle was in Shiloh was in the days of Samuel, about 1050 BC, 318 years earlier. Now what happened then, remember, was some of the people of the nation of Israel decided in the time of the judges, we're going to fight the Philistines. If we bring the ark along, we're sure to win. And they were treating the ark a bit like Micah's graven images or his family idols, weren't they? There's a thing that's magical properties will make us win all the wars. Of course, what happened was the Philistines captured it. When they did, God cursed them with diseases and they got rid of it. And it went back not to Shiloh but to Kiryat Jearim from there on, and it was never in Shiloh after that. So the question is, which of the two is right, and why is there this apparent conflict? Now, one of the other problems with verse 30 is if they had this false worship for not just 50 or 60 years, but for closer to 400 years, why didn't faithful people like Samuel or David do something about it? And I think that's probably a fairly reasonable request. And I found a number of possible alternatives, but I must admit the one that most suited me and made most sense to me was one that Harry Whittaker suggests, that where verse 30 says, until the captivity of the land, the Hebrew for land and the Hebrew for ark are almost identical, one single difference. And so perhaps 30 should read until the captivity of the ark, because of course the captivity of the ark and the time when the tabernacle went out of Shiloh were pretty much at the same time. And then there is no problem. All right, so I've talked about those stories, but we've called it Lessons from a Lonely Levite. So what are the lessons we can draw out from that, and how can we summarise them and take them to ourselves? Nationally, there are some really interesting lessons, I think. What we've presented in these two chapters is a picture of decline in religion that became endemic in the Northern Kingdom, and which is a really important warning to us. And it ran parallel with the introduction of false sanctuaries and false idols of worship. When Solomon's reign ended, you remember there were the two calves set up by Jeroboam, one at Bethel and one up at Dan. Interestingly, he picked the same place to set it up as the previous sanctuary was, because he thought that's a good one right up the top there, to try and stop people going back down to Jerusalem. And also, I think nationally, this story and the other two stories, the one of Boaz and the one of the second Levite in the last three chapters, are setting the scene for the kingdoms that were to come. The first king was going to be someone born in Gibeah in Benjamin, and the second king was going to be someone born in the city of David. It was David, of course, the second king, in Judah. And so mention of Bethlehem in Judah, and later in the next 2 or 3 chapters of Judges, mention of Gibeah and Benjamin are there so that people reading it later would say, yes, I see. There was a problem about where the kings were to come from, and God eventually decided they were to come from Judah, and his name would come through them, and eventually, of course, through Jesus. Personally, what lessons can we get from it? Well, the first one is obvious. Everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. Yeah. It's a bit hard to know when we're doing that and when we're not, but we need to recognise that if hundreds and hundreds or thousands of people did that in Israel, we can be prone to do it too, and we've got to be fairly serious about examining this. The second was that there could be a danger in idleness. Perhaps the Levite was not actively engaged in working for God. One comment said his idleness turned him to idols. And I think that's a nice summary of what possibly happened. And the lesson is for us. If we're not working in God's service, we'll end up working with some other idol in our modern day world, whatever it might be. The third one is that there is a danger of striving for status or wealth in the community or in the ecclesia. And we need to be very careful about that. Jesus' example is for us to be servants and not to be aware or striving for either status or recognition of any kind, and certainly not for wealth. The fourth one is that sometimes we behave as though we can control God rather than letting God dictate what we should do. The fifth one is we can be very easily deceiving ourselves in our lives, in our worship, in what we do and say and where we go, and those kind of things become more important than living a Christ-like life. That's a real problem, I think, for us all. The sixth one perhaps is, I think I'm up to 6, is easy solutions are easy, but they're often not the right ones, and we need to be prayerful about this. Micah chose an easy solution. I'll get one of my sons to be a priest and I'll set it up in my home. I won't have to walk down the road to the tabernacle and listen to the Levites telling me what the law actually says. Dan chose an easy one too. Let's get this guy and we'll make him our priest and we won't have to worry about what the other tribes are doing. And the final one is that the influence of mothers or any family or ancestors or the city where we were born or the city where we live All of these things can be for bad or good, and there's nothing about them that is particularly special. What is good is trying to follow God. It seems to me that the scary thing is that pretty much everyone in these 2 chapters, the mother, Micah, his son, the Levite, the spies, the Danites themselves, they all seem to be genuinely thinking they were doing a good job for their tribe or their family or for God. And yet the way they're portrayed here in Judges, it becomes very clear to us that they're all doing the wrong thing. So I guess the answer is, what about us? We need to seriously think about what we're doing, to read this rather quaint and weird story and say, it's got a lot of lessons for us, really. Thank you very much.